Keir Starmer has resigned as Prime Minister and he went out as he began, mouthing banal platitudes about our values and the rule of law. And honestly, I'll be kind of sad to see the back of him because in the dying days of his premiership, he seemed intent on taking out the Labour Party with him, clutching the fence like Sarah Connor's skeleton in Terminator 2 as the electoral bomb went off and wiped out his Fabian Socialist Revolution vehicle with his record unpopularity. However, his position was untenable because his own party turned on him and they wanted Andy Burnham instead. Well, his own party and the Boomers, because it turns out that there is an iron law of British politics. If you annoy the Boomer generation, you will lose. Because, as this handy graph produced by The Spectator shows us, his national popularity began to precipitously fall around the time of the cut to the winter fuel allowance. I do think that it was his tone-deaf, evil response to the Southport massacre and subsequent riots that cemented his premiership as being untenable. Remember, his response was not solidarity with mourners, but rather fury that traditionally Labour voting areas had dared to express their anger against mass migration, the grooming gangs, and yet another migrant murder of their children by kicking off. Because he showed up to the vigil, laid his flowers, got heckled, and was out of the town within about 30 seconds. And a more intelligent politician would have said, I feel your pain, this is not the way to express it. In due course, we will be transparent. I don't want to jeopardise the trial, but trust me, here's as much as I can tell you now, and we will take all the necessary measures to ensure that your children are never put at risk again, even if he didn't mean it, which he certainly doesn't. But instead, he allowed his lifelong mission as a foaming-at-the-mouth ideologue to take over, and he decided to take to national television every evening and declare his eternal enemy to be the far right, which just means the native population who refused to have their identity liquidated in order to fit into the post-national, impoverished and violent UK, rather than the formerly Great Britain that their ancestors handed off to them. Anyway, who is next? Well, it's Andy Burnham, the King in the North, as he is known, and it's because he was the only Labour politician with a positive approval rating, because he spent the last 9 years cutting ribbons and kissing babies and not having to own the national embarrassment that his party comported themselves as, either in opposition or as the government. And upon Keir Starmer's resignation, Andy Burnham announced that he intends to run for the Labour leadership. And it was speculated that there might be a contender, but it seems that it's just going to be a crowning, a coronation. Because even his most likely contender, Wes Streeting, of the Blairite faction, has decided to allow Andy to stand ostensibly unopposed. He wrote an open letter upon Keir Starmer's resignation and said Andy Burnham's victory was the reason that Keir Starmer has stepped down, as well as the devastating set of election results in May. Andy has shown what the Labour Party can be when we are inclusive, united, and in touch with the lives of the people this party was founded to represent. So, specifically, the industrial heartlands of the North that have been desolated by globalisation, which Tony Blair, Wes Streeting's mentor, at least his ally, under his true mentor, Peter Mandelson, once described as being as inevitable as the changing of the seasons and so impossible to resist. And actually, Andy Burnham's pitch during the Makerfield by-election was to undo decades of neoliberalism and turn the Labour Party into a patronage system for white working-class northern voters again. But then Wes Streeting let slip the untenable ideological tension in the Labour Party, which has caused them to stop representing those white working-class voters in the North. They might give Labour one more spin on the merry-go-round with Andy Burnham, because Andy Burnham's pitch was essentially reforming the Labour Party. Vote Andy for us being the Northerners, and the Labour Party who used to represent your father and grandfather's interests when they were working in coal mines and steel mills and shipyards. But Wes Streeting says, I left the government because we were losing the fight to nationalists in every corner of the country. I have spent weeks since speaking to our former councillors, activists and voters in the places that we lost, to listen and learn from them. Having spoken at length with Andy in recent days, I'm convinced that there is a place for those ideas under his leadership, that he is committed to building an inclusive party that draws on the best of our political traditions, and that he can win the fight of our lives against the forces of nationalism. The one thing that the Labour Party abhors is the notion that the British people, the English, Scottish, Welsh and Irish, are a distinct group with an exclusive claim of possession over the British Isles, who deserve representation in politics, and whose preferences and prejudices should be privileged over any other imported minority, ethnic or religious group. And Wes Streeting seems to think that Andy Burnham is the avatar for such concerns. And so, by the way, did the rest of the Labour Party, because after Andy Burnham was sworn in as the MP for Makerfield, they took this insufferable selfie in the Palace of Westminster. Our ancestors would weep if they were brought forward in time to see that this is the Britain that has been created. Look at the, not just lightweights and midwits on display, but the feminist harridans front and centre, sort of priming us for the insufferable girl-boshishness of Andy Burnham's tenure in Downing Street. You got devouring mother Stella Creasy up front, Natalie Fleet, who wanted to abolish the Magna Carta myth because it was apparently toxically masculine to have jury trials. And then all of the other women whose pathological compassion has led to thousands of white working class girls becoming the prey of their Pakistani clan clients in towns all across Manchester, which Andy Burnham, while mayor, again ostensibly did an inquiry into, but actually didn't use his powers as police and crime commissioner to hold anyone responsible for either covering the gangs up or actively facilitating the abuse to account. No social workers lost their jobs. No police officers were prosecuted for failing to bring the gangs to justice. In some instances, aiding and abetting the Pakistani drug traffickers who were also trafficking and abusing the girls themselves. And that's only going to get worse, because the women of the Parliamentary Labour Party have already written to and met with Burnham insisting that his government should be 50-50 split between men and women. So we're already going to have feminist quotas in Andy Burnham's cabinet. That worked out so well with first female Chancellor Rachel Reeves, who complained that people were mansplaining fiscal principles to her, and we've ended up with a £134 billion black hole, much larger than the one she claims to have inherited, because now benefits payments outweigh tax receipts. Absolutely fantastic. Yeah, let's do more feminist affirmative action, because it hasn't absolutely rinsed and wrecked the country enough. And it seems like Andy Burnham, cuckold in chief, whose policy prospectus is about as thin as his running shorts, is going to go along with it. Because the draft letter from the Women's Parliamentary Labour Party, seen by the BBC, demands, quote, "We are asking you to demonstrate this change from day one and address the toxicity and misogyny within our own party and government." Okay, so why should women vote Labour if apparently, according to the women in the most senior ranks of the Labour Party is institutionally misogynistic and toxically masculine? I might be prejudiced, but the man boobs, black t-shirts and eyeliner don't exactly scream toxic masculinity from Andy Burnham to me. Nevertheless, Burnham has moved to reassure the Women's Parliamentary Labour Party he is an ally at a meeting, promising to sack any staff who undermined women in his team. He is literally the soy jack handing over the form saying, is this guy bothering you? Labour MPs such as Lisa Nandy, his presumed deputy, have complained about feeling undermined by what they call a boys' club culture in Westminster. Nandy was complaining that actually Downing Street were guilty of misogynistic briefings against her. And they say this has been contributing to scandals, structural misogyny, bullying, and a blind eye being turned to reports of sexual harassment. Under the Tory party, it wasn't quite women who were the targets of sexual harassment complaints, was it? Anyway, this is such a SW1 parochial feminist complaint. The entire country is getting raped to death by migrants. My taxes are sky high. My bills are unbelievable. I've got 2 kids on the way. and I'm concerned about providing a future for them that is not just fiscally prosperous, but demographically secure. And every politician in the Labour Party remains indifferent to all of those problems, but instead they want to talk about anti-feminist microaggressions, just so that they can get a job in spite of their woeful incompetence. And Andy Burnham thinks that's a really worthwhile thing to do because he's vapid and vacuous and actually doesn't have any core principles. Like, the BBC was sending helicopters after his train in from Manchester to London like he was Lenin coming back to Russia. But instead, I suppose his premiership's going to look a little bit more like Diana's trip through the tunnel. The story of how Burnham conquered the Labour Party is actually just as banal. It's told in this Guardian article written by Jessica Elgott and Josh Halliday, quoting Labour insiders. They chalk up Burnham's campaign to become an MP and then Labour leader to 3 different factions. So, the launch of Mainstream, which is a Compass-founded campaign group that provided policy work and social media for Burnham to build his leadership campaign. Lawson, the Compass director, Neil Lawson, who had hosted the Ministry of Sound event with Andy Burnham and Louise Haigh, had decided the party needed a vehicle that would argue for a change in leadership, ostensibly to campaign against toxic factionalism. Every political party has factionalism, as we'll hear in this. Everyone knew this was a front for Andy Burnham's leadership, one MP observed. They didn't try to hide it much, and they didn't need to, because Keir Starmer was so unpopular that everyone was panicked that he was going to take the Labour Party out with him in an act of spite. I was praying for such an eventuality, but unfortunately, Giga Chad Starmer couldn't live up to the man we were manifesting him to be. Among those who are now making key decisions around Burnham, there are mixed views on how successful the project was, in part because some of the MPs who signed up were seen by others in the party as too far left, such as Clive Lewis and Nadia Whittome. And then came the second phase, initiated by Louise Haigh, Midgley, and Ed Miliband, to make Burnham the consensual will of MPs. The final piece of the puzzle would be Josh Simons, who many close to Burnham initially thought was a double agent of Number 10. I genuinely thought he was a spy. Well, it turns out he isn't, one friend of Burnham said. The boring personality politics and factionalism aside, it's clear that they see Andy Burnham as the only person who can save Labour from existential destruction. Which means they've got to be pretty desperate, because Andy Burnham is really unimpressive. The first opportunity for Burnham to return to Parliament, of course, came in Gorton and Denton, where Hannah Spencer completely demolished Matt Goodwin and Labour, who stood a Greek woman whose name I can't even remember, after Keir Starmer basically cut Burnham and blocked him from running in the seat. And I think, actually, long term, that was to Andy Burnham's benefit, because I think the Greens would have been able to marshal the Pakistani vote sufficiently to have sabotaged Burnham's chances, and then Keir Starmer would have stayed in. While many of Burnham's allies privately believed that Gorton and Denton was an option for Burnham, the groundwork had not been done with Labour's National Executive Committee or the trade unions to try to convince them to let Burnham run. Far fewer MPs than expected, 60, were prepared to sign a letter demanding he be allowed to contest the seat, and that's fewer than the 81 MP threshold that would have also triggered a leadership challenge if Burnham would have won that seat. And well, it's not necessary now because Starmer's stepped down, but way more than 81 MPs would have backed Burnham after winning in Makerfield. Gorton and Denton was amateur hour, one of Burnham's team admitted. Lucy Powell, the new deputy leader, the same Lucy Powell who said that the grooming gangs were a little trumpet and a dog whistle, was tearing her hair out because she was somehow expected to fix this. Trade union leaders were scathing that they had not been properly sounded out, or brought on side, and the Labour came in third, behind the Greens and Reform. So it was to, again, Burnham's benefit that he ultimately had Makerfield stand in, because he had more roots in the area, his kids went to school there, and he actually filmed his promo video to run as an MP before he'd even been guaranteed the seat, he was so sure. He wasn't sure about winning by the margin that he got. He was being told that he was going to get 49%, and he said, I don't know about that, lad, and he actually got 55% instead. But I think it would be a mistake to read his regional popularity after serving as Mayor of Manchester as a sign that he will be as popular nationally. What does Burnham actually believe? There's been this term called Manchesterism floating around, and what it is massive state subsidies handed to the north so that Andy Burnham can be well liked up there for bringing in new buses and trams, but actually that relies on massive state subsidies redistributed from the more prosperous south. The Times here crunched the numbers. The Office for National Statistics calculates that people in London pay £24,400 in tax on average, but get back just £19,500 in spending in public services. And anyone who's been in London and has used the trains or tubes knows this because they're shit. In the southeast, they pay £17,600 and get £15,900 back in public services. But in the Northwest, they pay $12,700 in taxes and get $17,300 back. In the Northeast, it's $11,200 and $17,400. So this is just patronage, or one might say bribery. And the Labour Party, traditionally, were a party that pitched themselves as providing dignity to northern voters because they were the working backbone of British manufacturing. So, steel, energy, creation of goods. But now, because all those traditional industries have been desolated, and because it's going to take generations to build them back up, and if Andy Burnham puts Ed Miliband in charge of either energy, still, or makes him Chancellor, they will never be rebuilt. This isn't affordable. They won't be able to produce all the steel or materials for data centers because the energy costs will be so prohibitively high because we already have the highest energy costs in the developed world. And Ed Miliband thinks that the answer to that is more windmills and solar panels for a region of Earth that gets less sunshine than Russia. If we were doing small modular reactors, if we reopened our coal mines, if we decided to drill in the North Sea rather than cement up our oil wells, if we decided to frack, then we would have abundant, inexpensive energy, and manufacturing would be much cheaper and, ironically, less carbon intensive than the nations that we have outsourced manufacturing to because they have cheap energy, don't care about carbon emissions, and use slave labour. But you'll be surprised to learn that all of that was about as absent from Burnham's opening speech as a shirt and tie. Because he decided to announce that he wants to do a number 10 in the North, because all he can do is wear a bucket hat and sing Don't Look Back in Anger. That's his entire pitch. That shtick is going to get really old and inauthentic pretty quick. But it means he probably won't live in Downing Street, and he's the first Prime Minister to do so for ages. He also promised more council housing and, quote, higher density residential developments to our towns. Translation: more battery farms for Eritreans, Somalians, and Afghanis who are just going to sit indefinitely in housing that is brand new, paid for by me and you. So while we go to work as mugs, they get to suckle at the teat of the taxpayer. And this means that the country is working for us, somehow. And it's because, well, they consume using redistributed subsidies, so they ostensibly contribute to the GDP because there's more people on the balance sheet engaging in more economic transactions. It's the economic equivalent of thinking that plugging your extension cable into itself generates power. And he also promised more devolution, which translates to more bureaucracy, wrapped up in Corbyn-esque slogans like for the many, not the few, and complaints that we are the most centralised country in the world. Oh, I wonder who was responsible for that. Maybe it was the Blair and Brown government that you served in, Andy, that created the Supreme Court, that expanded the human rights apparatus with the Human Rights Act, that ensured that the civil service actually runs the country through the Constitutional Reform and Governance Act, which means that you can't sack a civil servant when they do a bad job. Maybe it was the governments that you've been a part of and the successor Conservative governments who just adopted all of the things that you were pushing through as a junior minister in the Blair and Brown government. Maybe it's your entire ideology that has produced this problem. And this is why I don't actually think that the Burnham bounce will be all that pronounced. So the early polling from YouGov shows that Labour have gained about 2 points since Burnham has become the de facto next Prime Minister. And I actually think that people will soon realise that the man on the door has changed, but the same people are inside the building. That the establishment has just cycled out their salesmen. And that Andy Burnham actually has to own all of the unpopular products of that system that people blamed Keir Starmer for. Because the purpose of the system is what it does. And Starmer and Burnham played their part in building that system over decades, and now, by your fruits ye shall know them, the rotten fruits of that wretched tree are blooming. And we don't want to eat them. Nobody wants to eat them. In fact, the popularity of reform and the creation of both the Greens and Restore are symptoms of a general feeling of discontent with the system itself, and the Conservatives, Labour, and to a lesser extent the Liberal Democrats, because they're seen as the anti-political party, but certainly the Conservatives and Labour are seen as the right and left wings of that system, of the Uniparty. And so, I don't think that Burnham will be able to recover from Keir Starmer's record unpopularity. I think Labour is a tarnished brand, and I think more public exposure to Burnham, and the longer he deludes himself like Theresa May, that all he needs to do is be a nice person at the top of the system, and it will suddenly listen to him and do what he says. The more that he is in that position, the more unpopular he becomes. And so I actually wouldn't really worry about Andy Burnham. This take could age like milk. My predictions could be completely off. But I think that anyone who isn't willing to challenge the fundamental precepts of the system he has supported for his entire career will end up owning its mistakes. And therefore, this will leave an open path to government for anyone who is promising to demolish that system and revert us to the system which fundamentally worked not just before Blair, but before the disastrous socialist post-war governments that were not undone by Thatcher and Churchill and Major. And Burnham's promise to build an inclusive team at the highest level so that all parts of the country can see themselves represented will not win over white working class voters in the North, who, may have broken for him in Makerfield, but will soon find themselves running back to probably Reform UK, per current polling. Because if you look at the latest YouGov polling by ethnicity, we can see that white Brits are overwhelmingly voting for reform. They have an 8-point lead on the nearest competitor, which is the Conservatives, and they have an 11-point lead on Labour. If you look at Indian voters, they're overwhelmingly voting for the Conservative Party, because, well, they just had Rishi Sunak as the Prime Minister, Priti Patel as Home Secretary, and because the Conservatives do an inordinate amount of pandering to Indians. I mean, during the last election, they signed up to a Hindu and a Sikh manifesto. Only 9% of those are planning to vote for reform, so message to reform: stop running foreign candidates and stop campaigning with a migrant jamboree shouting vote reform in thick Indian accents. Your own voters don't want it. It is a sign that in the zero-sum game for representation and answering the question, who does Britain belong to, you're not willing to say the British people. And by the way, their Anglophile friends of foreign ancestry will also vote for you too if you say that, because they want to live in a country run by British people according to British culture, British preferences. It's only the people that want to take the country away from British people that won't vote for you. And in pursuing them, you will have to dilute your message and either become indistinguishable from the uniparty that has deprived us of our country, or you'll alienate your own voters while not picking up minority voters anyway. Of course, Burnham never was the sharpest tool in Keir Starmer's father's toolbox, and many of his former colleagues have said this about him. I mean, Starmer's team hates his guts. Quote, Keir worked under Andy in the Shadow Home Affairs team. Frankly, he thinks he's better than Andy, said one Number 10 insider. Neither do the Blairites. A new Labour-era cabinet minister told the Financial Times, after working closely with Burnham, that it's fair to say most of us who worked with Andy in government do not hold him in particularly high regard. He's a people pleaser. He is very effective at saying what people want to hear, but there was never any question at all of Andy saying or doing anything difficult, and that's a huge problem. Yeah, when you've got a hack at the Japanese knotweed of the civil service that is busy impoverishing our country and flooding us full of foreigners, if you actually wanted to address those issues, and I don't think Andy Burnham does, but if you wanted to, you'd need a comprehensive understanding of the law and policy, you need to have a competent team around you, and you would need courage to do unpopular things to return the country to a state of prosperity. And judging by all of his Labour colleagues, who are currently treating him like the second coming of a god they don't even believe in, yeah, he doesn't have exactly any of that in spades, does he? Another former minister from that period said, some ministerial colleagues recall encountering him as not a very good administrator. There was disorganisation and inability to make decisions, particularly difficult decisions, and him just wanting to be popular. They recalled, he's someone who wanted to be loved rather than someone who was driving forward cultural change in his departments. So the person we need the least right now, another career politician who bends with the wind and caves to the bourgeois opinion of Westminster media outlets, they're going to put him in charge rather than someone who actually wants to reconfigure the British state to make it actually deliver for the people in our country who have nowhere else to go. A lot of resentment from the Corbyn years too. Some of the Labour colleagues say, we were sticking our necks out and standing up for traditional Labour values, soft leftism and Blairism, and Andy was helping facilitate the hard left takeover of Corbyn. A former cabinet minister said, the thing that has engendered the most resentment is what happened in the Corbyn years. Lots of MPs who bear the scars of that period remember that over 5 years, when there was a takeover by the far left, Andy was just absent from the battlefield. Well, it's not just that. Served as Corbyn's Shadow Home Secretary. After previously working as a minister for David Blunkett, who tried to criminalise Islamophobia while the Pakistani grooming gangs were operating in his Sheffield constituency. Andy was not stupid, another says, and he worked out that we'd been flooded with 300,000 new members, most of whom had joined the party to support Jeremy Corbyn, and therefore to stand up to the leader would have stopped him getting Manchester, said one Corbyn ally from that period. So Andy Burnham has no principles. He is whoever the ruling power needs him to be at the time, and when he gets to the top spot, not just of the party, but of the country, when he becomes Prime Minister by default, well, excuse me if I don't think he has the courage to actually do difficult things that would improve the state of the country. He won't be deliberately evil and spiteful like Keir Starmer, but he will be a bumbling idiot with bad ideas that cause the country to get into even worse demographic and financial straits. And I suppose the only silver lining is he'll be booted out by sufficiently courageous, competent, patriotic force at the next general election. And this is why the right shouldn't be so quick to have read the Makerfield by-election as a barometer for the national mood. As one former colleague quoted in this article explains about how Burnham won Makerfield, quote, he does have core political beliefs, but they're based on how things affect people in his constituency. He's deeply rooted, and has lived in the same place for his entire time in elected office. He would always come in and say, someone said this to me in Morrison's at the weekend, we've got to look into it. It's not ideological, it's about people's daily experiences. So while he might not be the hated ideologue that Keir Starmer governed as, he is a northern partisan, and so that renders him unable to be relatable to more than half the country. Remember, the majority of voters are in the south, and also the Celtic nations are quite ethnically particular. They might bend back towards Labour if the wind is in Burnham's sails, but I actually doubt it. He's less hated than Keir Starmer, granted, but I don't think he has any unique charisma or winning policy ideas to bring thousands of disengaged white working class voters back onto the Labour plantation. So I actually wouldn't worry about Makerfield being a prophecy for things to come. I think, though, the right does need to double down on policy and on messaging. It needs to look credible. It needs to attract all sorts of talent, and not just candidates, but future civil servants, lawyers, policymakers. It needs to build up its war chest in anticipation for governing. Because it cannot get complacent, and it cannot spend so much time infighting that it neglects the more boring, quieter duties of drafting policy and handpicking people to staff the institutions in order to enact your agenda. And just to drive home how lacking Andy Burnham is in conviction, there's an interesting piece in the Times about his Catholic upbringing. Patrick Maguire writes that years ago, a younger, upwardly mobile version of Andy Burnham liked to explain himself to interviewers with a neat literal tricolon. There were 3 institutions that made him, shaped him, meant something to him. They were Everton Football Club, the Labour Party, and the Catholic Church in that order. And while both twice divorcee Boris Johnson and Tony Blair, later convert, were Catholics, not practicing, obviously. I mean, they support abortion, LGBT. They don't exactly abide by the duties imposed upon immigrant populations to conform to the host culture in the Catechism. Nevertheless, Burnham would actually be the first practicing Catholic Prime Minister. But what kind of Catholicism? Well, Burnham says, I've always said, and some people won't like this, that what I used to have to read in the Catechism, the enfranchisement of it on earth was the Labour Party. Yeah, unless we're talking about Nostratate, which, again, written by a gay Jewish man during Vatican II, in order to insist that we had to have cultural pluralism, otherwise the Catholic Church would somehow lead to the Holocaust. Unless he means that, no. Like, Catholic social teaching is not just what the Labour Party's been practicing for years, which is gay race communism. If anything, plenty of Labour Party policies, such as sexual libertinism, liberalism, according to Father Felix Sadra Salvani. I've probably butchered his name, but he wrote a really good book called Liberalism as a Sin. It's on the shelf next to me. All of those things that are deeply embedded within the mission statement of the Labour Party, well, they profane Catholic social teaching. So what is Burnham actually referencing? Well, he's actually referencing progressivism and socialism wearing a Christian skin suit, because Burnham owes a lot of his, what he calls Catholicism, but is actually just leftism, to listening to the sermons of the Archbishop of Liverpool, Derek Warlock. Warlock pushed for the Vatican to relax its edict on contraception for married couples, and wanted to allow for gluten-free communion wafers. I mean, that last one's not exactly that difficult, but still has a pattern of challenging tradition. And Burnham now admits to being about as Catholic as Joe Biden, because unlike Tony Blair, who apparently seeks out Catholic chapels even when travelling abroad, probably because he needs to spend hours in the confession booth and still hasn't atoned, Burnham is only an occasional mass goer. Quote, "It's about identity," an old friend adds. "It's not about whether you've read the latest encyclical." Well, actually, it is about understanding church teaching, and it is about attending mass, because Sunday is a holy day of obligation. You have holy days of obligation throughout the year. The entire point of mass is receiving the Eucharist. So if you don't go to mass, you're not a Catholic. If you support abortion, if you support gay marriage, if you support all sorts of libertinisms, you're not a Catholic. If you support mass third world migration, you're not a Catholic. You're also ignoring the lesson of the Tower of Babel in the Bible, and the warning in Deuteronomy that rule by foreigners is actually a punishment from God. So I wouldn't exactly say that Andy Burnham is a doctrinaire Catholic. I wouldn't say he's got a good grasp of economics. I don't say he's got much courage. I certainly don't think he's got very much charisma, or he's going to appoint the right personnel or have what it takes to take on the civil service. And so, given that he's vacuous, insincere, a truly performative male, I don't think Andy Burnham's got what it takes to reverse the Labour Party's fortunes. And so, rather than worrying about Andy Burnham, for whose name will be synonymous soon with all of the predictable, undesirable consequences of the hated system, I think that the right should worry more about its messaging, its policy, and its personnel. They should be preparing for government. They should be looking like the credible alternative and not being drawn into factional bickering, either within their own parties or between their parties. And should not be engaging in sort of short-term stunts. You should be looking like sensible people that want to do the necessary things to bring our country back from the precipice of demographic, cultural, and financial obsolescence. But also, you should be reminding people of the prosperity that awaits them on the other side. Like, sure, we would all eat gruel in the dark to ensure that our children won't become a hated minority in their own country. And, unfortunately, too few politicians are speaking in those terms. I don't actually think I've heard any party leader speak in those terms, even though there might be people in respective parties that would say, yes, of course I'm concerned about demographic change and I don't want the native British people to become a minority in their own country, just as the majority of their voters don't want that in poll after poll. But it's fortunate that actually that hardship isn't necessary. Because when we reverse mass migration, when we lift the yoke of this record tax burden, when we throw criminals in prison, when we do all of the sensible things that the majority of the country want to do, we'll have a nice country again. And so you can actually offer voters a positive vision while addressing the issues that likes of Andy Burnham and Labour and the Lib Dems and the Greens refuse to address, and that the Conservatives have no credibility on. So, frankly, Andy Burnham might well be just as bad as Keir Starmer, even if he does all of these unpopular policies with a smile and a sort of cheeky, chappy northern attitude. But his fate is just as doomed. The next election is for patriots to win if they can get their act together.